So it's April 28th, 2025 today. And that date really marks a moment, doesn't it? A point where India's response to that absolutely horrific terror attack in Pahalgam 6 days earlier really crystallized.
It certainly does. This wasn't just, the standard diplomatic back and forth. We saw some very decisive actions, multi-pronged, really.
Exactly. And it feels like we're looking at something more than just a reaction. It's almost a case study in how countries are now dealing with threats that are both, well, physical and digital.
That's a great way to put it. The interplay between those two spheres is becoming absolutely critical.
Let's paint the picture of Pahalgam again, because it's important. That beautiful area, they call it mini Switzerland, right?
Yeah.
Bizaran Meadow, Anantnag, Jammu, and Kashmir.
Such an idyllic spot.
Utterly. And then around 2 p.m. on April 22nd, just transformed into this scene of absolute horror. A targeted attack.
And the numbers are just dreadful. 26 people killed.
Including a Nepali citizen, yeah.
Yeah.
And over 3 dozen injured. Reports say the victims were mostly Hindu tourists, apparently identified by the attackers. It's chilling.
It really is. One of the deadliest attacks we've seen there since Pulwama back in 2019.
The reaction across India was immediate grief, but also a huge amount of rage. And Prime Minister Modi's promise, his vow to identify, track, and punish, that really set the tone, didn't it?
Absolutely. It signaled a very strong resolve, and that led directly to the response we're diving into today, which seems to have 2 main pillars.
Right, what people are calling a digital surgical strike, and then this very direct communication about media coverage.
Mm-hmm.
So let's kick off with that digital aspect. The big move on the 28th, the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting blocking 16 Pakistani YouTube channels.
Yeah, the scale of that is what's really striking. 16 channels. You're talking about a combined subscriber base of over 63 million.
63 million.
To just switch off access like that within India, that's a very bold move. Significant implications.
And these weren't, small fringe channels either.
Yeah.
We're talking major news outlets, Dawn News, Samad TV, ARY News, Geo News, Bull News.
Pretty much all the big names.
And perhaps surprisingly for some, even the channel of former cricketer Shoaib Akhtar, which, as you know, has a massive following everywhere.
Right, that inclusion is interesting. It suggests the focus wasn't just on traditional news platforms, maybe.
Perhaps. Now, the government's stated reason. They accuse these channels of spreading, and I'm quoting here, provocative, communally sensitive content and false narratives.
And specifically false narratives against India, against the Indian army, the security forces, particularly related to the Pahalgam attack itself.
Yeah, they got quite specific, didn't they? It wasn't just vague accusations. They alleged actual efforts to fan communal flames.
Exactly. Spreading misinformation about the attack, criticizing India's sovereignty, its military, its security agencies, that kind of thing.
And it even went a step further.
Yeah.
Some serious claims about certain channels soliciting funds for what was termed a war against India.
Now, that is a very serious allegation. It really elevates the stakes beyond just, biased reporting.
Definitely. And it wasn't a decision taken lightly, clearly. It involved the Ministry of Home Affairs and also the Indian Cybercrime Coordination Center, the I4C.
The central body for tackling cybercrime in India. So a coordinated effort.
So for someone in India right now,
Yeah.
if you try to pull up one of these channels on YouTube, what do you actually see?
You get a pretty standard but very clear message, something like, this content is currently unavailable in this country because of an order from the government related to national security or public order.
A digital wall, essentially.
Pretty much, drawing a clear line saying this content stops here. Though, the long-term effectiveness of these kinds of blocks is always debated, isn't it? People often find ways around them.
True. Workarounds, VPNs.
Mm-hmm.
It can sometimes push things underground. But the immediate impact, cutting off that huge audience, is undeniable.
Absolutely. A massive disruption.
Okay, so that's prong one, the digital strike. But the second part of the response was quite different. Not technical, but communicative. A strongly worded letter sent straight to the BBC's India head, Jackie Martin.
Yes, this was about language. Specifically, the government taking issue with the BBC using the word militants to describe the Indakars in Pahalgam.
Instead of terrorists.
Exactly. And the Indian government's argument was very direct. They felt militants downplayed the sheer brutality of what happened, an attack on innocent tourists.
Their point was that words matter profoundly in these situations, and using militants might somehow, maybe inadvertently, lessen the sense of terror, the targeting of civilians.
It's a really interesting point about semantics, but with huge implications. Terrorist carries that weight of indiscriminate violence against civilians, aiming to create fear for political ends.
Whereas militant, while still implying armed conflict, can sometimes maybe suggest a more political struggle, which perhaps doesn't capture the horror of Pahalgam.
Right. The government clearly wanted the framing to reflect their view. This was terrorism, pure and simple, targeted civilians.
And they didn't just object to that one word. They also flagged up a specific BBC headline they felt was problematic.
Ah, yes, the one that read, Pakistan suspends visas for Indians after deadly Kashmir attack on tourists.
From the Indian perspective, that framing was, well, misleading at best. It seemed to imply kind of cause and effect that wasn't quite right, linking Pakistan's later visa action directly back to the attack itself.
Almost suggesting Pakistan's action was a result of the attack rather than a response to India's own subsequent actions, like the visa revocations for Pakistanis.
Exactly. It muddies the waters. Headline framing is so powerful in shaping initial perceptions.
And it's worth noting, the BBC wasn't alone in this, initially at least. The New York Times also apparently used militants early on and faced criticism.
Didn't the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee even issue some kind of correction or clarification on that?
They did, yes, which suggests this isn't just an India-specific sensitivity. There's a wider, maybe growing international discussion about the importance of precise language when reporting on terrorism.
Okay, so let's broaden the view again. These two actions, the YouTube ban, the BBC letter, they weren't happening in a vacuum, were they? The Pahalgam attack clearly sent ripples, maybe even waves, through the India-Pakistan relationship.
Oh, absolutely. Tensions ratcheted up very quickly and very significantly, well beyond just digital platforms or media criticism.
One of the most, I think, startling moves was India suspending the Indus Water Treaty.
That was huge. That treaty has been incredibly resilient. It survived multiple wars between the two countries since 1960. It governs how they share crucial river water.
And India explicitly tied the suspension to Pakistan needing to, quote, credibly and irrevocably stop supporting cross-border terrorism, suspending that treaty. What does that signal?
It signals just how seriously India views the current situation and Pakistan's alleged role. Using water, a resource governed by such a long-standing vital treaty, as leverage in a counterterrorism context, that's a major escalation. It raises serious questions about regional stability and water security down the line.
And alongside that, the visa crackdown was almost immediate.
Yes, India revoked existing visas for Pakistani nationals already in the country, stopped issuing new ones, and gave them a deadline, April 27th, to leave.
Imagine that, suddenly being told you have just a couple of days to leave the country. We saw images of people rushing to the border.
It highlights the immediate human consequence of these high-level diplomatic fallouts. Real people caught in the middle.
And things were heating up physically on the border too, weren't they?
There were reports, yeah. Ceasefire violations along the line of control, the Lost Sea, apparently for 4 straight nights in places like Kupwara and Poonch, exchanges of fire.
Thankfully, no casualties reported in those incidents, but still a very worrying sign of the tension on the ground. A fragile ceasefire put under strain.
Exactly. It just adds to that atmosphere of mistrust and heightened alert.
Now, unsurprisingly, Pakistan didn't take these Indian actions lying down. They reacted very strongly.
A whole raft of retaliatory measures reported, suspending the 1972 Simla Agreement, which governs bilateral relations.
Closing their airspace to Indian airlines. Closing the Wagah border crossing.
Pausing bilateral trade. And responding very forcefully to the water treaty suspension, reportedly calling any diversion by India an act of war.
And, of course, vehemently rejecting any involvement in the Pahalgam attack itself.
It's a cascade, isn't it? Tit-for-tat actions across diplomatic, economic, and security domains. A significant downturn.
They even reportedly expelled military attaches, closed the Atari land transit post on their side, really winding down the points of contact.
It demonstrates a very strong condemnation of India's moves and a firm rebuttal of the accusations.
And the rhetoric from the leadership on both sides was also very strong. PM Modi, in his Man Ki Baat radio address, talking about the harshest response.
While Pakistan's PM Shehbaz Sharif was holding high-level meetings to figure out their counter-strategy, it signals that both sides were digging in.
Yeah, it suggests this wasn't going to de-escalate quickly. Messages of resolve being sent domestically and internationally.
Like, absolutely. High stakes all around.
So if we piece all this together, the digital block, the media messaging, the treaty suspension, the border incidents, the diplomatic tit-for-tat, it really does feel like part of a bigger picture, doesn't it? Especially this fight against misinformation in the digital age.
I think that's right. The Indian authorities clearly framed the YouTube ban as a necessary step against what they saw as deliberate exploitation of the Pahalgam tragedy.
Believing these channels were pushing an anti-India narrative, maybe spreading conspiracy theories about the attack, blaming the military.
Exactly. Using the attack as a trigger to amplify existing narratives or create new ones designed to destabilize or inflame tensions. It reflects that broader worry governments have about online platforms being weaponized.
And that connects back to the BBC issue too, doesn't it? The insistence on the word terrorists. It's about controlling the narrative, defining the event.
Precisely. Terminology shapes perception. India wanted to ensure the global understanding of Pahalgam was unambiguous, an act of terror against civilians with no room for justification or political framing that might soften it.
So where do things stand now, looking ahead? The immediate aftermath seems to have passed, but the underlying issues haven't gone away.
Well, the investigation by India's National Investigation Agency, the NIA, into the attack itself is ongoing. That's crucial for accountability.
And security forces are still on high alert, particularly in South Kashmir.
Understandably. Preventing further incidents is paramount in such a volatile environment.
We're also seeing or hearing reports of heightened readiness across the board. Army, Navy, other agencies in India, a posture of preparedness.
Which is a standard, perhaps prudent response when tensions are this high. It signals they're ready for any further escalation, real or perceived.
And diplomatically, it feels like things are still pretty tense, hardened stances on both sides.
It does seem that way. The path back from this level of escalation is often slow and complex. It likely requires careful diplomacy, maybe even some international nudging, which hasn't seemed particularly forthcoming yet.
And amidst all the geopolitics, the strategy, the digital battles,
Right.
we have to keep remembering the human element, right?
Absolutely. The people killed in Pahalgam, they were tourists, just there to see the beauty of Kashmir. Their deaths are the real tragedy here.
Targeting tourists like that, it's designed to inflict pain, disrupt normalcy, sow fear.
And the reaction inside India, the widespread outrage, the protests, the demands for justice that showed a real sense of national unity against this kind of violence.
So wrapping up our deep dive today, we've looked at a really potent, multi-layered response from India following Pahalgam. Going beyond just physical security, hitting the digital realm hard, controlling the narrative internationally.
It really underscores how central digital information and disinformation has become in modern conflicts and crises. And it shows a government taking very assertive steps to manage that space in the name of national security and public order.
It leaves you thinking, doesn't it? About this complex dance between controlling information, ensuring security, and upholding freedoms in a world that's so hyper-connected.
It really does. What does this episode tell us about the future? How will nations navigate these digital fault lines, especially during moments of intense crisis? That balance between security and expression, particularly when tensions are sky high, it's incredibly delicate, and the answers aren't easy, something definitely for all of us to keep thinking about.